So, I'd like to invite now our first keynote presentation for today. So, Errol's the business owner of Bluestone Edge Proprietary Limited, where he supports organisations and leaders to create inclusive and high performance cultures. Errol has worked with organisations, schools, NGOs, as well as in international war zones like Sri Lanka. These days he spends a lot of his time working in the sporting sector. He's passionate about creating a safer and more equitable world for all, by mediating conflict, coaching ethical leadership and facilitating transformation in individuals, communities and organisations. Errol uses person-centric, trauma-informed approaches to optimising culture, leadership and performance. He holds a master's degree in conflict facilitation, organisational change and a qualified psychotherapist. He's also the author of the Anarchist Organisation, How to Drive...
Anti-racist.
Anti-racist. Sorry.
But maybe anarchist too.
Well, whatever works, I say. The Anti-Racist Organisation, How to Drive an Inclusive High-Performance Workplace Culture by Dismantling Structural Racism. So worth buying a copy of that. And so please join me in welcoming Errol.
Thanks, Andy, for the introduction. Is Warren still here? Yeah. Thanks, Warren. That was really great. Great way to start the day. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Okay, let's try it again. It's like being in school again, right? Good morning, everybody. Hello. Good morning, Mr. Errol. Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thanks for inviting me, and hope you all have a great day. This topic, this work is really personal to me. So I'd like to share with you why, if that's okay. Is that okay? Just give you a thumbs up if that's okay. So my parents are from Sri Lanka and they migrated to England, and I was born in London and we came to Australia in the early 1970s. Now the timing of that migration wasn't coincidental. As a lot of you know, we had the White Australia policy in place up till that point in time. And as you will know, that meant you couldn't come to Australia unless you had white skin. So we were amongst the first wave of non-white immigrants to get to Australia. So we came from England on a boat, got to Melbourne, and settled in a suburb called Glen Waverley in southeast Melbourne. Some of you might know Glen Waverley. If you go through Glen Waverley now, because my parents still live there, it's full of my people. Sri Lankans, Indians, Pakistanis, Chinese folks. There's even a couple of Sri Lankan restaurants there these days. But when we got there in 1974 or 5, we were the only brown-skinned family in the whole suburb. So I was the only brown-skinned kid in my primary school, one of a handful of kids in my secondary school, brown-skinned kids in my secondary school. So from about grade 5 to about grade 9 or 10, the racism was pretty full on. On a pretty regular basis, I was beaten up, I was spat on, I was called names. They would write "go home," N-word in my textbooks. And back then, as we know, there wasn't the mental health awareness there is today. So looking back now, in hindsight, I was probably going through some sort of mental health challenge. For a lot of that time, I didn't feel valued, I didn't feel seen like I belonged, and I definitely didn't feel safe. So it's perhaps unsurprising that the best part of 40 years later, so much of my work involves supporting organisations to create cultures where people feel valued, seen, safe, and like they belong. I really believe that for a lot of us, many of us, what kind of shapes our direction in life is the need to create the kind of world that we ourselves needed as kids. That's certainly true for me. By the way, who has their own version of my story in some way? Different specifics, different context? Raise your hands. Notice the hands in the room. So my mission in life is that at some point in the future, at a conference, when somebody asks that same question, nobody has to raise their hand. So thank you for being part of that mission, at least for today. So if we change gears slightly and go to the topic, before I jump into the content, there's two pre-framing things I want to say. The first thing is some of this stuff is hard to talk about. So it's hard to hear. So please take care of yourselves. Take care of your friends and colleagues around the table. If you need to leave the room, please feel free to leave. I won't be offended, I promise. The second thing is around the terminology we use. I work in this field. I am still confused. Do we use POC, people of colour? Do we use BIPOC, black, indigenous and people of colour? Do we use black and brown? Do we use racialised people? In the UK they use BAME, BAME, black, Asian, minority, ethnic. In some circles people use people of the global majority. I got no idea. So you'll see in my presentation the terminology jumps around, which reflects partly my confusion and partly my desire to be as inclusive as possible. So apologies for the confusion. So the topic we can talk about today is the impact of racism on mental health. I'm going to do it in about 4 sections. The first section is to talk about, from a really high level, the psychological dynamics and impacts of racism. Then I'll talk about how the system of racism itself perpetuates itself. Then I'll talk about how that system impacts people's mental health. And finally, we'll talk about some organisational strategies to work with racism at an organisational level. How's that sound? I just want to say as we start, while the topic today is about racism, I really want to stress that that doesn't distract us or detract from or take away the focus I believe we need to apply to all systems of oppression, including, for example, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, classism, ableism. I'm hoping these principles we talk about can be applied to other systems of oppression. And I fully agree with Emma Lazarus, who says, until we are all free, we are none of us free. So let's just start with the facts based on research. Racism affects people's mental health. There's heaps of research to support this. So for example, 35 to 45% of people who experience racial discrimination show symptoms of depression or psychological distress. A meta-analysis of 293 studies found a moderate to strong association between racial discrimination and depression, anxiety, and stress-related symptoms. That's from the Lancet. In the US, a study of black Americans, 21% reported race-related traumatic stress symptoms at levels meeting clinical PTSD criteria. And finally, Indigenous Australians who experience racism are more than twice as likely to experience high psychological distress. Now, I just pulled 4 off the internet, but there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these studies. So let's just start with the research and the data. Racism impacts people's mental health. So let's start to understand, from my point of view, some of the reasons why that happens. Let's just start by defining some concepts and terms. People tend to use systemic racism and structural racism almost interchangeably, and I'm confused by it. Here's the way I understand it. Systemic racism is the system of racism. And I see it as literally a system. Those of you who know a bit about systems theory will know that the human body is a system. An organisation is a system. A pond in the middle of a forest is a system, or an ecosystem more specifically. And a system's main function is to perpetuate itself, to keep itself going. So as a body, human body, we take food and nutrition to keep ourselves going. An ecosystem has sunlight for photosynthesis and the rainwater to keep things going. The system of oppression called racism uses structural racism to keep itself going. Here's the metaphor I like to use. If systemic racism is like the organised crime family, structural racism is like the hit person or the enforcer. This great show on TV called Mobland, anyone see it? With Tom Hardy? Like, if you see it, Tom Hardy is the enforcer, right? The enforcer is structural racism. Structural racism makes sure people adopt and play by the rules, the unwritten code of the system to keep it going. Structural racism brainwashes us, creates biases, creates stereotypes, all intended to keep the system of oppression going. So let's define structural racism. It's how racism is embedded throughout society, throughout our institutions such as education, media, law, and then normalised in our attitudes, policies, systems and practices. The key word there is normalised. It becomes the norm, it becomes acceptable. And it's determined by who is advantaged and who is disadvantaged by these elements. So the fundamental way, in my view, racism gets operated is through inequity. Inequity is a difference in outcomes. So in most developed countries, if we study a whole bunch of metrics, for example, life expectancy, rates of education, rates of chronic disease, median income, median wealth, rates of education, rates of incarceration, the statistics skew away from BIPOC people and skew towards white folks in most developed countries. And the fact that that is still acceptable and normalised, because it still exists, is structural racism. It's a normalisation of inequity. Whoops. One of the effects of structural racism is internalised oppression. Internalised oppression is when the way our external oppressor or the oppressive system views, values and treats us becomes the way we view, value and treat ourselves. Howard Thurman said, if we are despised long enough, we eventually despise ourselves. In my view, this is one of the most insidious, impactful dynamics of racism. When racism is external, the bullying, the name-calling, hopefully, we have some sort of sanctuary and safety in a family, in a home, in a bedroom, in a community. But once that racist narrative takes residence inside our own psyche, it's with us 24/7, drip-feeding its toxic narratives, undermining our self-esteem, undermining our dignity, undermining our value. So much of our work is around noticing how internalised oppression shows up. Then in contrast, we have internalised dominance. This is when members of a dominant group are conditioned to see their position as natural and earned. And to internalise that, they are more deserving of society's resources. And as Robin DiAngelo says, dominant group members are affirmed, made visible, and represented in diverse and positive ways. The way this shows up is through like privilege and entitlement. It's the person at the meeting who feels free to just take up space, take up time at the expense of others. It's the person who believes their perspective, their opinion is more important than everybody else's. It's the person who believes that success should flow to them relatively easily. Right? And these two concepts are complicated because there's intersectionality. So as a man, as a person of colour, I have this dynamic of internalised oppression. But then as a cisgendered heterosexual man in a sexist, transphobic, homophobic society, I've internalised dominance. So we all have this like mix of tension points inside of us. So the important piece of work, I believe, is to like work on our internalised oppressions from whatever we experience that from. And also simultaneously recognise where we have internalised dominance, where we have privilege, and to do that bit of work simultaneously. Because every time we work to liberate ourselves from internalised oppression or internalised domination, we transform the culture we live in. So that's the internal part of this work. This work has to be done at an internal level as well. Definitely at an interpersonal level, at a group or a cultural level, but also at an internal level. Grappling with our own demons, our own entitlements, our own privileges. That's a critical part of being able to hold space and work with these dynamics. First part done. Shall we change gear, friends? So, some of you may have heard of Audre Lorde. If you have, raise your hands. Amazing woman, identified as a black lesbian feminist, was really prominent in the 1980s in the civil rights movement. And she wrote a great piece, and a great quote she's quite famous for, which says, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." It's an amazing essay. You can get it online pretty easily. If you feel inclined, I recommend you check it out. I've read the essay multiple times. It's so powerful. Every time you read it, you get a new kind of learning from it. But what she means by the master's house is the system of racism or any form of oppression. And the master's tools are the tools which emerge out of that system. And her saying the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, what she's saying is that any tools which come from the master's house, which emerge out of that system, will never dismantle or disempower that system itself. Now, as amazing as her essay is, one thing she doesn't do, unfortunately, is go, what are those tools? What are the tools the system uses to perpetuate itself? So that's been my research for the last year or two. Is through my work going, what are the ways the system kind of plays out in groups, in interactions, in relationships that perpetuates racism? So there are 4 tools I've noticed. We'll go through them in a second. But the master's tools refer to how structural racism uses a set of tools which may appear innocuous because they're so normalised in society, in our thinking. We're all brainwashed this way, all of us. But they function to perpetuate structural racism by centralising power with those who are racialised as non-BIPOC, basically white. And what I hope and what I believe is that these tools are also useful in how we address other systems of oppression. My work has been mostly around race, but please play around with these tools in other systems. Maybe let me know how it works. Around sexism, around transphobia, around homophobia, around anti-Semitism, around Islamophobia. So the first tool is the decentralisation of racialised individuals' feelings, experience and humanity. By that I mean it goes back to like the belief system that racialised people have less value, are less human, and so are perceived as the other. And by decentralised, what I mean is that the experience, the feelings, the pain, the trauma is pushed more to the margins. Minimised, invalidated. If you look at slavery, to apartheid, to colonisation in Australia and around the world, to the murder of George Floyd, to the way Adam Goodes was treated, the consistent theme is a minimisation, decentralisation of people's feelings and humanity. This is why the BLM movement was so powerful. BLM was clever saying Black Lives Matter. It's a direct rebuttal, provocation to the narrative that says black lives don't matter, black feelings don't matter, black experiences don't matter. And what happens with this decentralisation process, it happens both in groups and in individuals. So what I mean by that, it occurs at an interpersonal level between us and an intra-psychic, within our psyche. Because the behaviours and biases are perpetuated through the two aforementioned dynamics. In BIPOC folks, we can tend to, through internalised oppression, minimise our own feelings. We skip over them. We talk about painful stuff in a really matter-of-fact way. Or the emotion comes up, we push it down again. All know the experience? Yes? Right? So, yes, no? Great. Especially therapists among us. You'll see people who've been marginalised do this all the time. We say that it was fine. That it wasn't that big of a deal. Tell a really painful story in a really matter-of-fact kind of way with the emotion taken out of it. We do it to each other. When people get emotional talking about something painful, we don't say, Andy, come back to that spot you mentioned. That was really important. That sounds painful. You kind of race through the experience. And then in non-BIPOC groups, it gets perpetuated via internalised dominance. We take up space. We don't make space for the black and brown voices and experiences. So this is one of the ways that, again, one of the tools the system uses to keep itself going. The second tool is perpetuates a cultural load, where BIPOC folks do the work on the behalf of and for the benefit of non-BIPOC people, often without the rewards. I see Warren laughing. So the most obvious example is slavery. But then if you look through history and in current times, exploitative forms of labour such as sharecropping, indentured servitude, convict labour and sweatshops, which are integral to capitalism, have all exploited BIPOC folks. So we know in our country's history how Indigenous folks were used for cheap and basically free labour. Then in the 1830s, when they were discovered no more convicts coming over for cheap labour, they imported coolie workers. Coolie was a slang term for people from South and Eastern Asia. Again, cheap labour. So that's from a racial capital point of view. Serves capitalism. But also this happens in groups and organisations, where people have to speak at cultural awareness events or about racism for their entire race. So Warren, what do Aboriginal people think about X? Right? Sarah, imagining Sarah. What do Sudanese folks think about Y? It homogenises a diverse culture. and the cultural load we carry is skipped over again. And for a lot of people, this cultural load, just being in a group, just being present in a group where there's racial biases and microaggressions, takes a huge amount of work. And that work often goes unseen, unrecognised, unvalued. Who can relate, by the way? Just being in groups? Yeah. So being mindful of who's carrying the load, especially the emotional load, the cultural load in interactions. Who do we allocate to stand for their whole race and culture, and in the process, like, homogenise, de-diversify that culture or that race? We do it all the time. And it puts a huge load on people, and that's the load that affects well-being. Physical well-being, shortens lives, creates chronic disease, and creates mental health challenges. I did some work with the AFL about 3 years ago with the Multicultural and Indigenous Summit for the AFL. I worked with just the Indigenous players group for like 3 hours. And I walked out of the room and basically burst into tears. Because what football clubs don't recognise is the huge cultural load these young Indigenous players have to face by being in mostly white clubs. That goes largely unrecognised. It's huge. So recognising the cultural load is really important. The third tool is the use of stereotypes and tropes to pathologise how racialised individuals react to racism itself. Let's talk about stereotypes. Our brains are wired to see patterns and make links. That's fine, that's how we learn. I feel this, therefore this. I touch the hot oven, that hurts, not a good thing. That's fine. Stereotypes form because of the messages we get sent from society, law, education, media, magazines, billboards, and social media. Again, we can't help that. That's just how our brains are wired. However, while stereotypes, positive and negative, abound for most groups of people, there's a tendency to have more negative stereotypes linked to groups that have been historically as well as currently disenfranchised. So here's the study from the US. They tracked how black folks and white folks are seen on the TV news compared to the actual stats from the Department of Justice. And what they found is that black folks are overrepresented as criminals and white folks are overrepresented as victims compared to the actual stats. So what's that saying? Black folks, criminals, white folks, watch out for black folks. They'll mug you, or worse. And this just seeps into our consciousness. Some of you might recall a girl in WA who was kidnapped, Cleo Smith, I think her name was. 2 years ago. Remember that? Big case in WA. And the kidnapper happened to be an Indigenous man. And when they arrested him, it's so, in my head, it's so fresh. The newscast said he was arrested wearing a black t-shirt. Now, they can't say he was a black man, but they had to make the link, black kidnapper. That's how subtle it is. When we see footage of kids getting arrested, they cover their face on the TV news. But we show their black arms or brown arms, correct? Or their brown legs. So we know, yep, that kid who just got arrested, that's a black or a brown kid. And stereotypes pathologise and minimise people's natural and healthy reactions to racism and other forms of discrimination. Back in my 20s, many years ago, I owned a very cool black convertible sports car. In my 20s, right? Lived in the Gold Coast at the time. And the cops would pull me over every 2 or 3 weeks. First question I got asked, almost every time, was, whose car is this? And I knew the question was going to happen, and every time this fit of rage went through my system. I won't swear here, but my thinking was, how effing dare you assume because of the colour of my skin I haven't got the intelligence or the work ethic or to afford this car legitimately. Who can relate, by the way? Few. But I knew if I let that rage seep out, even slightly, into my verbal or non-verbal communication, I just couldn't do that for 3 reasons. The first one is that I'm going to get shot or arrested. Correct? Second one, if I do that, it just confirms their stereotypes. The angry black person or brown person. The third reason is that if I do it, the next time they pull over someone who looks a bit like me, they have less room to manoeuvre. So because of my care for my brothers and sisters who look a bit like me, that rage stays in my system. So where's that rage go? I go home, I might go to the gym and work it out. I used to go home and cry sometimes. Or our bodies just wear it. So that rage is a natural, normal response to racism. But the stereotyping means don't be the angry black man. A, because it confirms the stereotype. B, because we'll arrest you or shoot you. So noticing how people resist the stereotypes or being the stereotypes they need to be to process pain and discrimination is a key part of the work with this area. If the stereotype compartmentalises the experience, right, racism wins. This also basically plays out around unacknowledged privilege. In my book, I talk about privilege. If you have privilege, it's like swimming with the current. If you haven't got privilege, it's like swimming against the current. So person A, person B, swimming in the river. Person A, they're with the current. Person B, the current's against them. Both folks, roughly equal swimming ability. Both folks working roughly equally as hard. After 3 minutes of swimming, person A is way ahead. They look back and go, what's wrong with you? Are you like slack or something? Don't you work hard? You can't be as smart as me. See the stereotypes coming? So that person believes their forward progress is based purely on their own work ethic, intelligence, capability, as opposed to the current pushing them along. This happens in reverse too, by the way, where people go, look at Stan Grant, the Australian journalist. Look how successful he is. Look at Beyonce. Look at like Oprah Winfrey. Look at Michael Jordan. There's no racism. They're amazing and successful. Yes? Heard that before? But they don't think for every Stan Grant or Michael Jordan or Oprah Winfrey, there's 100,000 million kids who don't feel seen and valued and acknowledged and supported to achieve their dreams because the current's flowing against them. So, acknowledging privilege and seeing how that relates to stereotyping is the key part of the third tool. The fourth and final tool is that racism creates a low tolerance for discomfort. and thus works to reduce risk and maintain the status quo. So this happens through changing the subject, deflecting responsibility, white fragility, or blaming inequitable outcomes on the people themselves, as per the last point. And it's often framed as a lack of safety, but it's actually a lack of tolerance to discomfort, and they're very different things. Psychological safety helps us to endure discomfort, to push the boundaries, to challenge, to be innovative. That's a good thing. Whereas comfort actually seeks to avoid discomfort. So comfort works to maintain the status quo, not push the boundaries, not challenge authority. So as leaders in this space, it's key to differentiate or discern the difference between a genuine lack of psychological safety and people getting wobbly around, just being uncomfortable. And I work in sport a lot, so I often use the metaphor of a workout at this moment. If we're in the gym doing our workout and we go, my arm's getting tired, I'm going to put the weights down, nothing changes. We've got to do a couple of reps, a couple of kilometres on our run, past the point where we feel uncomfortable to get the benefit, yeah? This is the same. How do we increase our tolerance to discomfort? I would argue that what we call acting out is a healthy response. That's the only response to racism, to bullying, to discrimination. Those behaviours don't happen in a vacuum. Historically, culturally, at that school experience, the family of origin experience. So how do we see behaviours and then normalise them? Going, of course, how else would he, she, they respond, given the context? That's a totally natural, normal, predictable, healthy response to the environment that they're in. So how do we change the environment? What racism does a lot, it tends to focus on the individual and avoid the system. And what happens is that racism is a system, as I said before. It's impersonal. It doesn't say, Errol down there in Melbourne, I'm going to make Errol feel bad about himself. It just does its thing. It's a system. But the impact is so personal. So how do we support the individual in the system and then normalise their behaviour through the context of the system they're existing in? And rather than pathologise the behaviour, normalise the behaviour. Going, of course they're going to react this way given the context, given their environment, given their history. Second part done. So, just from a very high level, quick summary, how do these four masters tools impact people's mental health? So decentralisation results in silencing and invalidation. Feelings, experiences get pushed to the market, get pushed to the side. Most of us know so much of working with people is validating, witnessing, hearing. This is the opposite of that. So from people from racialised backgrounds often feel their experience of racism is dismissed or minimised. And this can intensify feelings of isolation, anger, helplessness, further damaging mental health. So the medicine for this is to really notice people's feelings, their reactions, their experiences, bring them back to it. Bring people back to the people in the group who are having these barely poking to the surface of their consciousness, feelings and experiences. As all of you will know in this field, racism creates unequal access to mental health care. So because there are so few culturally safe providers, culturally safe, culturally responsive, there's language and communication barriers, geographic and financial barriers, and a distrust in the system from past experiences. So the cultural load creates chronic stress and psychological harm. Because where people from marginalised racial groups face ongoing discrimination, microaggressions and social exclusion. So how do we notice in groups who's doing the work? Who's doing the emotional labour that's largely unseen? Stereotyping leads to internalised racism and identity harm. Stereotyping basically pigeonholes our identity and pigeonholes our diversity. We're all individually diverse people. We all have a range of roles and experiences inside of us. Every one of us is diverse internally. And stereotyping goes, you are only this, as a woman, as a person of colour, as a gay man. And that causes massive identity harm and psychological distress, which can affect self-esteem, identity development, and cause depression and shame. Finally, low tolerance to change fosters hopelessness, depression, and exhaustion. Because we go, no matter what I do, it's never going to change. We need some hope some days, right? That things are going to get better, things are going to change. When the system just continually kicks our bum, we think no matter what I do, the system just doubles down, perpetuates itself. Some strategies to address racism in organisations. Just discussing these concepts, clarify understanding. Don't have to agree, just go, here's my understanding of internalised oppression from my own lived experience. Now, we'll all have slightly different versions of that. That's a great start to explore concepts and ideas and terminology. Secondly, foster psychological safety. That's kind of my thing, you might have guessed already. I think psychological safety is the holy grail of organisations. We can't have conversations that are safe and constructive about race, about gender, around mental health without psychological safety. And often we'll do these anonymous surveys, like culture surveys, pulse check surveys. And leaders tell me, we scored really high in our safety survey. And I'll tell them, if somebody didn't feel safe, do they feel safe enough to say they don't feel safe? And their jaws just drop. Like, yeah, hadn't thought about that. So just these anonymous surveys, even like one-on-one surveys. Because if you don't want to be like the disruptive black person, then you won't raise the issues. You don't feel safe to raise the issues. So being aware of privilege and power as we create safety is a key part of it. The third thing is do an inventory, evaluating how are these masters tools showing up, or any kind of racism. How are they showing up, firstly, intrapersonally, inside people, through internalised oppression, through internalised dominance. How are they showing up interpersonally, in how we communicate and relate to each other? And how are they showing up culturally, in what our culture at our school, hospital, organisation normalises. So it's the 3 levels of how these things turn up. Intrapersonally or intrapsychically, interpersonally and culturally. And finally, cultivate constructive feedback. Where calling in and calling out become culturally normalised. I believe constructive feedback is the single most powerful tool to align people to cultural, behavioural and performance expectations. But if we are a manager or a leader, it's a bit like broccoli, I say. We know we should do it, but we avoid it at all costs. Right? We're right on time. So I just want to thank you for your time today. Thank you for inviting me. This is hard work. It requires so much of us, and it's personal for many of us. And it can feel hopeless sometimes. The system keeps pushing back on us. And when I have those moments I come back to this. It's a saying from the Talmud. Whoever saves one life saves the entire world. So thank you for the work you're doing in this space, all of you, in your own ways. And thank you for hearing me out today. Thanks again.